Thank you, Bruce, very much. For those of you who know Joan, you realize how not Joan Troccoli I am. So I do very much appreciate her sharing her presentation with us, and I'm honored to be able to read it. The first thing I did was go through and scratch out all the big words, so I didn't have to worry about how to pronounce them. I'm personally very disappointed that Joan couldn't be here because I was looking forward to a visit. And she would have done 1,000 times better with this presentation than I'm going to. But she put a lot of effort into this, and so you're still going to learn a lot, and I think enjoy it. Use your imagination. When I say I'm speaking for Joan, not for me. So I will just get started, and I guess we want to have the lights come down. And you can let me know if that's too dark enough. Chris is going to get the ones in the back. Well, the first thing Joan says is that the recent catalog, Russell catalog, published by the Montana Historical Society, is the best book ever written, period. Okay, that's really not exactly what she said. I did ad-lib a little bit there. But she is very complimentary about it, and we do appreciate that. Okay, we heard from Diane. Diane said, can we have a little more light? Diane and Jenny from the Historical Society are recording all of this. So for people who couldn't be here, this will eventually be posted on our YouTube channel within the next week or two. And you can go home and watch it again or share it with your friends. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll get started. Okay, my topic today is the relationship between two giants of American Western art, George Catlin and Charles M. Russell. Catlin stands at the beginning of the golden age of Western painting. Russell flourished towards the end of that era. Despite the gap of 3 generations that separated Catlin and Russell, they were kindred spirits, united above all by their fascination with and sympathy for American Indians. I must confess that I'm a little bit nervous that Brian Dippy, a preeminent scholar of both Catlin and Russell, and a great mentor of mine, is here today. So I will just do one aside. If Joan would be a little bit nervous, I am very nervous. Brian expertly treated the very subject I am speaking about this morning in Looking at Russell, his 1987 landmark study of Russell's style and artistic sources. Brian's work has influenced me greatly, and the best I can hope to do today is to contribute a word or two to the discussion that Brian began more than 25 years ago. Russell was just 8 years old when Catlin died in 1872, and there could have been no direct personal communication between the two men. But their lives, their interest, their art, and their outlook on the West and its people intersect at many points, both formally and philosophically. Let's begin with a few words on George Catlin. He was born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in 1796. He grew up on farms in Pennsylvania and New York, and he enjoyed nothing more than being outdoors, hunting, fishing, and riding horses. Catlin was interested in Indians, and he collected the Native American artifacts that turned up on his father's farms. He also occasionally dabbled, quote, dabbled with the brush. At the insistence of his father, who was an attorney as well as a farmer, Catlin went to law school. However, he abandoned his legal practice after a few years to pursue a career as a painter in Philadelphia and New York City. Catlin's formal training was just about nil, and his most visible achievement in New York, a portrait of Governor DeWitt Clinton, was ridiculed by critics and fellow artists. Catlin's prospects for success as an artist were fading when he formulated a bold artistic mission rooted in his childhood love of Indians and the outdoors. Catlin had observed that the Indians he encountered growing up in the Northwest had lost most of their land and much of their traditional culture during their 200 or so years of coexistence with whites. Catlin was convinced that Western Indians would confront similar losses as the United States expanded to the West. In Catlin's mind, as well as the minds of most white Americans at the time, all American Indians were doomed to disappear, either by death or assimilation into white society. Catlin's response was to embark upon an epic project, a panoramic presentation of American Indian life based on his own eyewitness experience. Catlin painted Indians in the East, but he was far more interested in the Indians who had escaped the degrading effects of extensive contact with whites. To find such Indians, Catlin had to travel well beyond the western frontier of settlement. And this map gives you an idea of where that settlement was in 1830. The darker the shading, the more Euro-Americans were living there. I've stolen a lot from Brian over the years. Here's his map of Catlin's Western tours of 1832 to 1336. As you can see, for most of the 1830s, Catlin traveled in the trans-Mississippi West, painting portraits of Indians and depicting their customs and natural and man-made environments. Catlin traveled mostly by river, voyaging on the Mississippi, Missouri, and Arkansas, although he also made a grueling overland trek across what is now Oklahoma in 1834. Catlin made his closest approach to Russell's territory in Montana in 1832, when he spent several weeks at the American Fur Company's trading post, Fort Union, which is located near the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers at what is now the border between Montana and North Dakota. To be exact, the fort is in Montana, the fort is in North Dakota and the parking lot is in Montana. Fort Union's legendary chief proprietor, Kenneth McKenzie, set Catlin up in a studio in one of the bastions of the fort, from which he had a commanding view of the surrounding prairie. And this is how the fort, reconstructed in the 1980s, looks today. Catlin sitters at Fort Union included many Northern Plains Indians, such as the Pagans of the Blackfoot Confederacy, who would be portrayed frequently by Russell half a century later. Catlin painted these Indians near the end of a period of about a century, when they were all at their wealthiest. Over the years, since the arrival of Europeans in North America in the 16th century, the Pagans and other Plains Indians had acquired horses, which revolutionized their cultures. They had also obtained consumer goods, including forged steel blades and tools, beads, tin cooking kettles, and woven cloth, for which they exchanged beaver pelts and buffalo robes. Contact with whites had enriched them, but not yet limited their freedom. At Fort Union and other trading posts on the Northern Plains, Catlin painted representatives of all the tribes who figure prominently in Russell's art, including the Lakotas, Mandan, and Crow. By the end of the 1830s, Catlin had produced almost 500 Indian portraits, Western landscapes, and scenes of daily and ceremonial life among the tribes of the upper Midwest and the Plains. He had also collected thousands of native artifacts. Catlin called his collection the Indian Gallery. And here is part of it on exhibit at the Renwick Gallery in Washington, D.C. in 2002. Catlin exhibited the Indian Gallery widely in the United States and Europe. For nearly all who saw it, Catlin's Indian Gallery was their first glimpse of the American West and its peoples. Catlin's images molded popular conceptions of Native Americans that persist to this day, especially an enduring popular identification of all American Indians with Plains Indians. Catlin launched two of his Western expeditions out of Charlie Russell's hometown of St. Louis, which at that early date was a small town with a population of fewer than 5,000 souls. By the time Charlie Russell was born in 1864, 34 years after Catlin first arrived in St. Louis, the city's population had grown to over 160,000. Steamboat traffic had increased, although the fur trade, which had dominated commerce in Catlin's days, was in decline. There were still good adventure stories from the upper Missouri to be heard when Russell loitered around the docks. Russell's overriding desire as a kid was to experience the far west that Catlin had known as an adult. As you all know, Charlie's parents reluctantly allowed him to go to Montana to realize his dreams in 1880, just as he was turning 16. After trying out life on a sheep ranch and as an assistant to a market hunter, Charlie found his métier as a night wrangler of horses for cattle roundups in the Judith Basin. He also worked hard at his art, which, like Catlin, he had taken up at an early age. Like Catlin, too, Russell disappointed his parents with his unconventional choice of career, although it soon brought him to public attention. By 1893, when Russell retired from the range to make art full-time, his fame as the Cowboy Artist had spread through Montana and beyond. At the beginning of his career, Russell carved out a place for himself by depicting the cowboy life he had known in the 1880s. But as his career wore on, his interest increasingly shifted away from his own time to the era during which Catlin had roamed the West, when buffalo were abundant and plains tribes that depended on them were at their most powerful and prosperous. Russell called this the West that has passed, and it ultimately became the dominant theme of his art. The Indians who had once commanded the Western world had also been decimated by warfare and European diseases to which they had no immunity. Most of the survivors had been forced onto reservations. Thus, Russell's visualization of the old, heroic West depended on the worlds and pictures of those who, like Catlin, had preceded him there. This holds true for a subject that became a pillar of Russell's iconography, the buffalo chase on horseback. George Catlin took part in buffalo hunts at Fort Union, and he rode out with the Hidatsa, who engineered the thundering surround you see here on the upper left. Russell must have greatly envied Catlin's experience of Indian buffalo hunts. There was nothing comparable to be seen in his own time. Catlin's art was by no means Russell's only model for the imagery and the spirit of the West that has passed. Prints after Karl Bodmer, a Swiss contemporary of Catlin, were also an important source of information for Russell, and so were the paintings of Karl Weimar, a Western artist of the 1850s, whose pictures were prominently displayed in St. Louis when Russell was growing up. By contrast, Catlin's Indian gallery was inaccessible to the public during Russell's formative years. In fact, Russell probably never saw a single original painting from the Indian gallery. It was in storage in Philadelphia from the early 1850s until the 1880s, when it went on view at the Smithsonian in Washington. But Russell did not visit Washington until 1925, and I've never seen any evidence that he saw the Indian gallery at this late date. However, that doesn't mean that Catlin's work was totally invisible to Russell. Catlin published many illustrated books, some of which were aimed at young boys. The best source of Catlin's Indian imagery was his book, Letters and Notes on the Manners and Customs and Conditions of the North American Indians, which was published in 1841 and remained in print continuously thereafter. Letters and Notes is illustrated with more than 300 line engravings drawn after the paintings in Catlin's Indian gallery. The book was effectively the Indian gallery in portable miniature form, and it came to be a handbook of information and images for artists of the West. Take a look at a couple of examples here. Details like this were especially helpful to genre painters like Russell. A scene of his Comanche Indians, a scene from Russell's boyhood sketchbook, which shows us that Russell had a copy of Letters and Notes in his home library in Great Falls, and it is inconceivable that he didn't consult it much earlier in his lifetime. Catlin's attacking the grizzly bear. Russell's boyhood sketchbook. Fuller-bodied reproductions of Catlin's originals were found in a portfolio of 31 lithographs published in London in 1844. It was called the North American Indian Portfolio, Hunting Scenes and Amusements of the Rocky Mountains and Prairies of the Americas. He liked long titles. As its title suggests, the portfolio was dominated by wildlife and hunting subjects, seemingly calculated to appeal to Charlie Russell. At least 15 of the plates in the portfolio were issued in the United States by Courier and Ives in much larger quantities and at a much lower price than the original London edition. This was a golden age of intellectual property piracy, which helped ensure that Catlin's images were ubiquitous. Catlin's antelope shooting. Russell's boyhood sketchbook. Foreshortened figures on their stomachs were a favorite motif of Russell's. Ultimately, they may have come from Catlin's prints. Catlin recorded Indian customs and pursuits in both words and pictures, which made his works especially precious to genre painters. Like many of Catlin's genre scenes, the painting is rather schematic, but there is plenty of ethnographic information here, from the way the buffalo robes were pegged and stretched for scraping to the Comanche's method of drying meat on wooden racks. The clarity and simplicity of the illustrations and letters and notes made them convenient models for an inspiring and even mature artist of the West. An artist could edit or elaborate Catlin's images at will, pulling out just a few motifs and details or adapting an entire compositional scheme to his or her own purposes. By Russell's time, the experience of intact native cultures that Catlin had enjoyed in person was available only secondhand, including, of course, in Catlin's own words and images. Thus, it was only to be expected that Russell would have consulted Catlin for genre pictures such as The Silk Road. Catlin image of Band of Sioux moving camp, colored lithograph, Catlin Sioux moving camp from letters and novels, a line drawing, and Russell's Indian women moving. Here, another comparison of Indian women as represented by Catlin and Russell, suggesting Russell's debt to Catlin in detail as well as overall composition. However, if we skip ahead 13 years in Russell's career, a significant difference between Catlin's and Russell's treatment of this kind of domestic genre subject becomes apparent. That difference lies in Russell's attention to and elaboration of the human element in genre scenes. It is as if the young Charlie Russell borrowed the skeletons of Catlin's images as they appeared in letters and notes, deployed them in early works, such as Indian Women Moving, and proceeded over the years to complicate and ultimately transform them both formally and expressively. This is a distinction between Catlin and Russell that became a gulf as Russell's career went on. Even though he could never have seen the indigenous activities Catlin recorded, Charlie Russell's presentation of these subjects are so emotionally varied and rich that we are almost convinced that he did. They convey the feel of a real life in a way that Catlin's work often does not. The same contrast holds true when we compare Catlin's and Russell's treatment of a more masculine subject, such as Indian War Council. As Brian noted in looking at Russell, the Catlin composition was a source for Charlie Russell's pictures of Indian warriors in council. The engraved version from letters and notes, the closest copy of a Catlin model from Russell's hand that I know of. This is the seed of many late compositions by Russell, in which the basic motif of a circle of spectators is maintained even as the surrounding action and environment become more complicated. This is a more ambitious council scene by Catlin. The figures are more carefully studied and more varied. The declaiming figure is based on a well-known pose taken from an ancient sculpture, the Roman senator type. This is about as monumental as Catlin gets in a multi-figured composition. But just compare it to Single-Handed, which is the ultimate extrapolation of the Indian council category of subjects in Russell's art. Russell adds so much absorbing ancillary stage business, so many subgroups of actors and spectators to the core of Catlin's iconic composition that when we compare it to Indian council, it is as if we are viewing a formal and expressive leap akin to that from still to moving pictures. Don't get me wrong, Catlin was capable of conveying great depth of human feeling, but he did so in his portraits, perhaps because he was first and foremost a portrait painter, not in his genre pictures. And it must be said, most of Russell's portraits of Indians lack the humanity and pathos that infuse so many of Catlin's. For his part, Russell was a genre painter, not a portraitist. In looking at Russell, Brian noted that Russell's protege, Jody Young, quote, detected Catlin's influence in Russell's boyhood sketches. But de Young also asserted that Catlin had no influence on Russell's mature work. This is depressing for Catlin scholars, but the observation is basically true. The Catlin fan is even more disheartened by Russell's statement, recorded by de Young, that Catlin was a poor artist, and he didn't mean financially. Be that as it may, there is no question that Catlin was the source of key segments of Russell's iconography, as well as Russell's knowledge of Indians in general. But Catlin had a different kind of effect on Russell, a philosophical one, that was at least as important as formal influence. In his writing as well as his actions, Catlin promulgated an informal code of practice for Western artists that was highly influential in the 19th century and remains in force to this day with many painters of the American West. First among these dictates of Catlin's unwritten code was the requirement that the artist be accurate. Catlin rested most of his claims for his art on the trustworthiness of his works from a purely documentary point of view. Catlin intended his Indian gallery to be a contribution to science as well as to art. Catlin was a pioneering anthropologist who also dabbled in geology, mineralogy, and zoology. His scientific theories were incorrect from about 80 to 99% of the time, but as a pure observer, he made contributions of lasting value. Catlin certainly described himself in letters and notes as if he were a scientist doing path-breaking research. He dismissed armchair ethnography and the received knowledge that came from books, which in his view merely perpetuated old errors. He had a taste for the new and sensational. More than once in letters and notes, Catlin declared that he would not have believed many of the things he encountered in the West had he not seen them himself. But Catlin always assured his readers his mission was to discredit slanderous assumptions about Indians and to unearth and report the truth about their unknown and even secret lives. To support the claims that his paintings were both amazing and true, Catlin collected certificates attesting to their accuracy from prominent Westerners, including Army officers, Indian agents, and fur trade executives, all people who, each in his own little realm, knew Catlin's subjects better than he did. Here we see the autographs of both Peter B. Porter, U.S. Secretary of War, and Kenneth McKenzie, Catlin's generous host at Fort Union. The most important signatory of Catlin's certificate was William Clark, the reigning American authority on Western geography and Indians in the early 19th century. Catlin was wise to secure these certificates because, just as he feared, his work was denounced as false by a number of his competitors in the Western art business, including John James Audubon. From Catlin's time on, the question of accuracy, or lack thereof, became an issue, and often a very contentious one, whenever an artist of the West was discussed. Accuracy went hand in hand with another article of Catlinian dogma, authenticity. To be authentic, an artist's depiction of a subject had to not only be accurate in every detail, but also hard-won. It wasn't enough to sketch a subject from life. The artist had to earn his right to make a particular image, preferably at some risk to his own life and limb. To create a faithful portrait of an Indian, Catlin insisted, an artist must abandon his studio to seek his subject out on his own home ground. Only then could an Indian be at ease emotionally and spiritually, and thus a fit subject for the artist who wanted to fully capture his appearance and character. Going to one's subject obviously entailed some travel. A Western artist in quest of authenticity had to make a journey, preferably a long and risky one that also served as a rite of passage. Catlin saw his Western tours as journeys in time as well as space. With every mile he put between himself and the modern world, he entered more fully into the past, arriving finally at a much earlier stage of civilization. This idea that going into the wilderness was the same as traveling back in time to witness an earlier stage in human development was a common one throughout the 19th century. The objective was total immersion in one subject, and if in reality was somewhat less than that reason, Catlin was always prepared to dramatize the length, danger, privations, and mind-blowing exoticism of his travels in the West. There are more than a few self-portraits in the Indian Gallery in which Catlin shows himself in the thick of the action. For example, here he is at the site of Colonel Henry Dodge, commander of the 1st Regiment of U.S. Dragoons, when the U.S. Army made its first, somewhat nerve-wracking contact with the Comanches in the Southwest in 1834. Charlie Russell did not claim to be a scientist, but the quality and credibility of his work for his contemporaries, as well as many people today, rest on his accuracy and authenticity. As we all know, Russell not only abandoned his comfy boyhood home in St. Louis for the far rougher accommodations of the Montana frontier, he actually lived the life he depicted. Russell's cowboy pictures derive from his own decades of hard work on the range. Like Catlin, Russell documented his participation in Western life by including himself in some of his pictures. These selfies are comparable to Catlin's certificates of authenticity, especially when they appeared in illustrated letters to people who had shared or at least knew enough to fully understand the challenges of Russell's youth. This is an example of an invitation to attend the annual meeting of the Montana Stock Growers Association. Russell shows himself as a rep, or one who was charged with retrieving his employer's cattle from an open range roundup, taking with him the horses that will help him do his job. Only an insider with knowledge of this practice would interpret this image correctly. For Catlin, authenticity, or being there, trumped other artistic values such as perfection of drawing and composition and high finish and execution. Catlin argued that artists couldn't achieve such rather effeminate objectives while they were prosecuting an arduous journey in the West. Catlin explained that the unfinished and unstudied condition of his pictures as works of art were unavoidable because he had painted them while paddling my canoe or leading my pack horse over and through trackless wilds at the hazard of my life. A pretty impressive feat for any artist if he meant that literally. A sketchy, unfinished, or otherwise awkward execution served as almost a guarantee of a painting's fidelity to the truth, as long as the artist had taken the trouble to see the subject firsthand. In other words, lack of a polished style equaled unmediated view or truth. Authenticity could trump artistic training altogether. Being self-taught, which both Catlin and Russell claimed to be, was a virtue because they had not been taught the illusionistic tricks and stylistic flourishes that came with conventional training. Of course, both of them did in fact learn these things from other artists and from books, and there was plenty of imagination in their works as well. Catlin set forth another value in Western art, that of primacy, which simply means being the first, or better yet, the only, person to depict something of note in the West. Being first was a feather in one's cap that could both impress scientists and generate the popular attention and monetary rewards that attach to novelty. Incentives like these could, of course, lead to fudging. For example, Catlin claimed to have been the first white man to see the Red Pipestone Quarry in Minnesota, which he visited in 1836. Catlin's claim of primacy was false, but Catlin, who was something of a genius at self-promotion, publicized his detailed study of the quarry so well that a Boston mineralogist named this form of pipestone Catlinite in his honor. As the 19th century wore on, it became progressively more difficult for the artist to claim to be the first to see or depict anything in the West. With primacy increasingly hard to achieve, the distinction of being the last observer and painter of one thing or another was invoked as a way of conferring value on an artist's work. For his part, Catlin claimed to be the first and the last to depict several subjects, most notably the Okipa ceremony of the Mandan, whom he visited in 1832. 5 years later, the tribe was nearly destroyed by smallpox, and Catlin was indeed the only artist to see and paint the Okipa in its traditional form. In letters and notes, Catlin repeatedly reminds his readers that the places and the people he is recording are rapidly passing away. They are remnants and avatars of a golden age. Later generation of Western artists, well into the middle of the 20th century, would invoke this same mantra. And I'm sure someone is doing it even now. Artistic reports of the demise of the Old West have been coming in for close to 200 years. They must all have been greatly exaggerated because the West continued to perk along for such subsequent generations to depict. It is time to wind down my talk, and I'd like to note something on which Catlin and Russell did not agree, their feelings about progress in the West. Everywhere Catlin looked, as he voyaged up and down the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, he could envision the future wealth and improvements that would be introduced into this land by the burgeoning American population. For example, on this site, you see here, which is the junction of the Missouri and Platte rivers, Catlin foresaw a large and flourishing town, which he thought would be a very fine addition to the landscape. His prediction was correct. The city of Omaha was founded here in 1854. George Catlin was far more sanguine about the big changes to come in the West, which he hardly saw, than Charles Russell, who actually experienced them. By Russell's time, going far, far west no longer meant going back to an earlier age. In fact, modern infrastructure and city planning made western places like Charlie's hometown of Great Falls more up-to-date than cities back east, thanks to the hydroelectric power generated by the falls in this stretch of the Missouri River. Great Falls was, and is, known as the Electric City. Cheap, reliable sources of power were a magnet for industry. In his advertisement for the Silver Dollar Saloon, even Russell had to concede that the smokestack of the Boston and Montana copper smelter was the most prominent feature in Great Falls. But if Russell was thrilled by the modernity of Great Falls, he did a great job of hiding it. He professed only disdain for the nesters and boosters who had built such mini-cities in Montana, and stated in his curmudgeonly way that Montana was a damn sight better country for a man to live in when it was peopled only by Indians. Catlin and Russell may have viewed the March of Progress differently, but both understood that its principal victims were the dispossessed native peoples they admired so much. Big Sail, an Ottawa chief painted at Mackinac in Lake Huron, whom Catlin described as a, quote, miserable victim of white man's cupidity, degraded, discouraged, and lost in the bewildering maze that is produced by the use of whiskey obtained from fur traders and its concomitant vices. Here, Russell makes the plight of an aged Indian even more poignant and distressing by presenting him as a curiosity to be viewed by a Gibson girl on a bicycle ride. She is a deceptively innocent-seeming symbol of what Catlin called an irresistible juggernaut of white settlement and industrial development of the West. Catlin's Western tours took place during the height of the removal period, following the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which decreed that all Indians living east of the Mississippi River must give up their ancestral lands in exchange for new homes in Indian Territory. Letters and Notes is loaded with Catlin's outrage at this policy, as well as his denunciations of the traders, the government, and the land-hungry citizens of the United States, all of whom destroy Indian cultures and displace impoverished Indian people. Russell also viewed the territorial disposition of Indians as a national disgrace, and he identified the same villain as Catlin, the insatiable greed of whites. Catlin would have recognized Russell's land hog, making his successful appeal for yet more territory to Uncle Sam. Both Catlin and Russell made before and after portraits to dramatize the loss of dignity and personal integrity suffered by Indians subjected to the political and economic power of the white man. Catlin's pairing presents, on the left, Pigeon's Egghead, an Assiniboine from the upper Missouri, on his way to Washington, D.C. for a diplomatic visit in the fall of 1831. Catlin admired his beautiful clothing, which included a buffalo robe emblazoned with the battles of his life and a headdress of war eagle's plumes, as well as a proud demeanor. The following spring, Catlin happened to encounter Pigeon's Egghead on his return home to the upper Missouri. Now he is laden with dubious gifts from his government hosts, a broadcloth military coat, high-heeled boots that make it hard for him to walk, a top hat, an umbrella, and a fan, and worst of all by far, a jug of whiskey. Pigeon's Egghead has been rendered harmless and ridiculous by whites. Catlin goes on to relate that he was murdered by a fellow Assiniboine after tribal authorities concluded that his stories of the marvels of architecture and displays of military might he had seen on his journey were dangerous lies. A similar, but visually more subtle transformation was presented by Charlie Russell in his images of generic Blackfoot Braves of 1858 and 1898. Like Pigeon's Egghead in 1831, the Blackfoot of 1858 is beautifully turned out in native dress. His facial expression denotes pride and self-sufficiency. His counterpart of 40 years later has exchanged his buffalo robe and deerskin leggings for a trade blanket, a European-style shirt, and a white man's felt hat. He makes a direct appeal to the viewer, hoping to sell a hat rack made from buffalo horns to to a tourist on a passing railroad train. The inclusion of the buffalo horn hat rack gives a tragic resonance to Russell's Blackfoot Brave of 1898. As Catlin wrote in Letters and Notes, the bison and the Indian were joint and original tenants of the soil and fugitives together from the approach of civilized man. They have fled to the great plains of the West, and there, under an equal doom, they have taken up their last abode, where their race will expire and their bones will bleach together. Russell, like Catlin, viewed the decline of Indian populations and the disappearance of distinct Indian culture as inevitable. The continued adaptation of Indian peoples to new circumstances was to them a loss of an ideal way of life. Russell and Catlin thus shared a sense of their art as a memorial. Catlin described his work on the Indian gallery as lending a hand to a dying nation who have no historians or biographers of their own to portray with fidelity their native looks and history, thus snatching from a hasty oblivion what could be saved for the benefit of posterity, and perpetuating it as far as a fair and just monument to the memory of a truly lofty and noble race. The far more pithy Russell put it this way: "This is the only real American. He fought for his country. Today he has no vote, no country, and he is not a citizen, but history will not forget him." And that's the end of the presentation. So